the past is gone, the future is not yet real, and the only thing that exists is the present.
Did things you used to think sounded a lot more absurd now seem a lot more realistic?
We're actually living in a multiverse with many, many, many different versions of us whose lives then go off to evolve slightly differently.
How does this impact you?
Some days not at all, and some days it does a lot. You just have moments of being like, oh, is time real? Just be like, no, don't think about that too much. It's just when it comes to the truth claims about the existence of God that it leaves me behind, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I'm super delighted to be joined today by Emily Qureshi-Hurst, who is a philosopher of religion and science at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. So Emily, thanks so much for joining me. The first thing I want to ask is, what exactly does a philosopher of religion and science get up to? What kind of questions, what kind of themes, areas are the kind of things one may explore? I guess which is quite a wide range in area, but can you give us a bit of insight?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I mean, a philosopher of religion and science is a pretty broad title and doesn't give you that much information about what I actually do. But broadly, I work in a field called science and religion, or theology and natural science, as we call it at Cambridge. It's a subdiscipline of theology as a whole, but I don't engage these questions as a theologian. I'm not religious. Maybe that's something we're going to get into. I instead engage these questions using the discipline of philosophy as my kind of tool and language to engage them. So that's what it means to be a philosopher of religion and science. To be somebody that studies religion and science is to be somebody who's interested in the interaction between the religious way of seeing the world and the scientific way of seeing the world. And again, that's super, super broad. So science and religion contains people of all sorts of religious faiths, although it is kind of dominated by Christianity, but that's changing. And people who are interested in all different kinds of science. So I'm particularly interested in Christianity and physics. But yeah, science and religion can contain a whole host of stuff. So I basically look at the relationship between Christian theology, the philosophy of religion, and physics. And I'm looking really at the biggest questions that we can ask about ourselves and our place in the world. So who are we? What does it mean to live on this planet? What's the cosmos like? And what implications does that have for various different religious ideas? Are physics and Christianity compatible? It's these sorts of questions that I'm looking at, and I think about them in a philosophical context rather than from a particular religious tradition, say.
Yeah, so that's the things I wanted to ask you about. So if you were to study at university, PhD, so on religion and theology, as opposed to doing it from a philosophical angle, a philosopher, looking at these different, what's the difference there? Is it certain topics, a way of studying it, mixture?
Yeah, it's a mode of inquiry, I think. So, the first thing I should say is that these two disciplines aren't completely neatly separatable. They're basically on a spectrum. So you've got theology here and philosophy here, and then there's a lot of overlap at the borderlines, and I guess that's where I sit. So I'm interested in questions about the nature of God and the nature of the human person, and whether that's best describable in religious terms or scientific terms or philosophical terms. All the way over here, you might get philosophers who are interested in, say, questions completely distinct from God and religion. So like, what is a number, or what's the world like? How can we come to understand the world? And then all the way over here, we've got theology, which might be studying a particular theological tradition or a specific theologian or a specific religious text. So they differ in terms of what they look at, although there's that overlap in the middle, but also in terms of methodology. So theology, I guess philosophy works a lot from first principles, tries to use logic and reason, whereas theology is, of course, wants to be rational and logical, but also looks at religious texts and theological tradition. Particular theologians are seen as authoritative voices. So, there's lots of different ways people would distinguish between philosophy and theology, but I think methodologically they're different. When you're reading a philosophy article and when you're reading a theology article, you know you're reading two different things. Of course, in that middle ground where I work, things get a bit more messy, and theology and philosophy kind of blend together when you're asking philosophical questions about religious topics.
So if we're going to get like a complete understanding of these kind of areas, do we need to do inquiry through all these different ways, science, philosophy, kind of Christian theology? Do all of them equally valid and we need to investigate in all different ways?
I think so. I think they all bring something interesting and unique to the table. And this is something that scholars in the past used to recognize more than we recognize now. So for as long as there's been science, there have been people who have been thinking about science in dialogue with religion and philosophy. A great example is Isaac Newton. So he's known obviously for his groundbreaking physics, his discovery of gravity, his laws of motion. But he actually wrote a lot more theology than he did physics. It's just that the theology wasn't very good and the physics was pretty groundbreaking. So we remember him as somebody who did physics. But he, in the early modern period when he was writing, he was engaged in a discipline called natural philosophy, which contained theology and science and philosophy and geometry, mathematics, all together. And we've seen in the intellectual tradition, these disciplines become fragmented. And so theology peels away, philosophy peels away from science, and you see the increasing isolation of these disciplines. And that's solidified by the structure of universities. So you have a philosophy department and a physics department and a theology department, and you get jobs in particular departments, and it increases this kind of intellectual isolation of the disciplines. And what I really like about science and religion, the field that I work in, is it's really trying to overcome this and say, let's work together. Let's bring scientists into the conversation, philosophers into the conversation, and theologians into the conversation. And each brings a unique perspective that can really help illuminate some of the most important questions we have. There's a philosopher called Mary Midgley who put this really nicely. So she says, think about the world like you would a complex terrain like a mountain range. She says you'd need multiple maps to properly represent the mountain range. You'd need topology, you'd also need routes at the top, etc. You need these different maps. You can't capture everything about this complex landscape without having different perspectives on it. And the same is the case with the universe as well. We need physics to tell us about its fine structure and the mechanics of how it works. We need biology to talk about how the creatures that inhabit the universe function. But we also need philosophy to ask deeper questions about what it all means, and theology to ask whether there's a God as well. So you can't answer the biggest questions without taking all of these disciplines into account, in my view.
Sure. It's fascinating what you said about Newton also doing some theology, not as good as his physics. Just briefly, what was some of the theology you wrote about?
I haven't read any.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you, unfortunately. It hasn't stood the test of time in the way that his physics has.
Sure, yeah. So I think another thing you mentioned earlier is that you have like a particular focus on looking at physics and Christianity. Yeah, could you tell us a bit about what you look at in those, in that kind of intersection?
Yeah, so I've written on quite a lot of different areas in the intersection between physics and Christianity. My two main projects have been on the philosophy and physics of time and what that might mean for various Christian ideas. And the other is on quantum mechanics, particularly the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So it's sometimes called the quantum multiverse. And thinking about how plausible Christianity is in this scientific context. But I've also written about divine action, so whether physics makes it easier to believe that God acts in the world, whether the universe was fine-tuned for the emergence of life, and whether that indicates that there was a creator, all sorts of stuff. It's hugely rich, the intersection between religion and physics. So yeah, there's so much to be said and to be written about. So yeah, I've touched upon a few different areas, but the two main ones are time and the quantum multiverse.
Okay, sure. Before I get into asking you about maybe both of those separately, you mentioned earlier that you're not, I think you said you're not religious, apart from, I guess, it being fascinating and interesting. Do you see any particular benefits of exploring the intersection of physics and religion if you yourself are not? And I'm intrigued maybe how you got into that if you're not religious. It's kind of two questions in one.
Yeah, so I was raised in a vaguely Christian context. So my mum and dad are not particularly, well, they're not Christians. they're spiritual in different ways. But my granddad and my grandmother, well, my granddad was a Christian priest, and they were both Christian, and so I would sometimes go to Sunday school when I was staying with them. So I've been exposed, and I went to religious schools, as is common in the UK, and so Christianity has been part of the cultural lifeblood that's I've just been a part of. I've never believed it to be true, but I've always found it interesting and worthwhile. I mean, 85%, according to some recent surveys, 85% of the world's population are religious. So even if you're not religious yourself, I think it's worth taking it very, very seriously as one of the most significant and overarching ways that humanity has tried to understand its place within the world. So I think it's worth studying in its own right for that reason. But the way that I got into it was actually, as a teenager, I was really into Richard Dawkins. I was very anti-religion, and I thought you could use science to disprove religion. So I read The God Delusion, got really excited about it, wrote about it in my personal statement, wanted to go to Oxford to study philosophy and theology, to kind of look at these questions in a bit more detail. And then I got to Oxford and very quickly realised that a lot of what Richard Dawkins was saying was bad scholarship, very reductive, painting this view of religious people that was just inaccurate, and that it's just not as simple as he thinks it is to say that science defeats religion and that's the end of it. So I got into studying theology and science in that way, and now my view has been completely changed. So although I'm still an atheist like Richard Dawkins, I have a lot more respect and time for religion than he does.
That's fascinating. So what are some of the later thoughts that you had in life that you realised, Dawkins is not thinking about things correctly? What are some of the ways to oversimplify things?
Yeah, so he defines religion in terms of fundamentalism by and large. And he talks about the dangers of fundamentalism and says that even more mild religion is a breeding ground for fundamentalism, normalizes fundamentalism, and so it should be opposed. I just think that's false. I think that most religious people are not fundamentalists in any sense, abhor, despise, feel disgusted by what religious extremists do in the name of their religion. I also think that his view of the relationship between religion and science is misguided. So he sees religion almost like a bad science. It's an explanation of the world. It's a theory about how the world works that you can't test or verify in an empirical way like you would a scientific theory. But that's not what a religion is. Religion makes claims about the world like a scientific theory does, but it's also about being part of a community. It's also about how to live a moral life. And so he makes this erroneous assumption that religion and science exist on the same level. They compete over the same intellectual domain, i.e. explaining how the world works. Science is better and therefore religion should disappear. But the better way to think about it, in my view, is that they operate on different levels of explanation. They're different kinds of thing. So if you want to know how the world works, if you want to know the structure of the atom or how species evolve, you look to science. But if you want to know how to live a good life or what it means to be a member of a community, science can't tell you the answer to that, but religion can. So these two things can exist together, and you can be a religious scientist. And so when I encountered more and more people who were religious scientists and who held this more multidimensional and interesting view of the world and the relationship between religion and science, I realized Dawkins was wrong.
So if you're not religious in the sense that you believe in a particular god or any gods, but you think that religion, as you said, maybe have to give you provide you guidance on how to give a life in a way that science can't, what would religion be doing for you to help you with that? Is that through engagement with the kind of religious community, involving yourself in kind of religious rituals? Like how would it help you if you at the same time don't say you're religious in the sense that you believe in a god?
Well, so I don't use religion to help me in that way because I'm not religious, but religious people do, of course. I mean, one of the ways that I guess you could is to look at the teachings of particular religious figures like Jesus or the Buddha, and to use them as examples of moral exceptionalism or moral, I don't want to say perfection because I don't think any human can be perfect, but as excellent moral examples for how to live. So Jesus, for example, spoke truth to power, said, "Blessed are the poor," argued against people who used the letter of religious law to oppress people, the sort of stuff we see happening a lot in Christianity today is exactly the kind of thing that Jesus was fundamentally against. And so if you look to somebody as an example of how to live a good life like that, then I think it can be valuable. It's just when it comes to the truth claims about the existence of God that it leaves me behind, I'm afraid.
Okay, I've enjoyed this little detour. I'll go back though to something you said earlier, which is, I was asking about physics and Christianity, and I think you talked about some of the areas that your work covers.
Philosophy of time, philosophy and physics of time, and the quantum multiverse.
Sure. I want to ask you a few questions about these one at a time. So philosophy of physics and time, can you start with that one and just lay out, the kind of things you're looking at when you're doing work in this area?
This is my less accessible area of research, so it gets quite technical quite quickly. I'll do my best to explain it in a way that your audience will find interesting, but not completely alienating, because it is, it's quite technical. So basically, the question that I was asking in that research project was, what is time? And that includes things like, does time pass? Is time real? Is time like space, or does it flow like a river? And the answer to that question will have significant implications for various different religious ideas. So I looked at philosophical arguments for different ways of understanding time, and scientific arguments as well. So particularly Einstein's theories of special and general relativity. And maybe I'll just draw this distinction that's drawn in the philosophy of time between two different types of time. So the A theory of time and the B theory of time. The A theory of time is the intuitive understanding of time that most of us have, which is that the past is gone, the future has not yet arrived, it's not yet real, and the only thing that exists is the present. That's actually a specific kind of A theory called presentism, but that doesn't really matter too much for our present purposes. And according to the A theory, time passes, and what is now, and therefore what is real, changes from one moment to the next. The B theory, on the other hand, is a theory of time that says time is actually much more like space than we realize. Instead of the past being gone and the future being not yet real and the present being the only thing that exists, all moments of time exist. So just like India exists, even if I can't directly observe it because I'm not there, so does 1842. It exists even if I'm not there to observe it. And now, most people, when they encounter these two theories of time, think, well, the B theory is obviously wrong. That's very counterintuitive. It must be the A theory that's right. But actually, the more we look at physics, the more it seems like actually the B theory is right. So temporal passage is an illusion. The fact that the past is gone and the future is not yet real is also an illusion. And I was interested in what that means for particular religious ideas, like the idea that somebody might undergo a process of salvation. So if you change from being fallen to being saved, that seems to require the passage of time and this fallen version of you not existing anymore and the saved version of you being the only version of you that's real now. But if the B theory is true, then all the past versions of you exist out there, including the sinful ones. And so the question I asked really was, is salvation really possible? Given what we know about the physics of time, Einstein's relativity theories, and their philosophical interpretation.
B theory is a little bit more counterintuitive than A theory. Is there anything about A theory that's particularly counterintuitive as well?
Well, I guess one of the consequences of the A theory, so it's called the truth maker objection, because it seems to make it impossible to make any true statements about the past. So generally, there's lots of different ways of thinking about how truth works, but one of them is the correspondence theory of truth, which says something is true if there's a statement about it, say, and then that corresponds to something in the world. So my name is Emily is a true statement because it corresponds with me, a person whose name is Emily. But if the past doesn't exist, then it seems like we can't make any statements about the past that are made true. So saying the dinosaurs existed no longer seems to make sense because there's no thing called the dinosaurs that can ground that truth in concrete reality. So actually you only end up being able to make true statements about the present. So it's quite a technical objection, but that's one of the things that seems to be a bit counterintuitive that follows from at least presentism. One of the A theories of time is that you can't really make true statements about the past.
Okay, that's a great overview. Let's move on to the kind of second area of your work, which I guess you'd say is a bit more involving the questions around like the multiverse and
Yes.
Things like this. So yeah, could you give us like a kind of brief overview of what you get up to here?
So I'm working on an interpretation of quantum mechanics called the Everett interpretation. So without wanting to get too technical about what quantum mechanics is, I'll just basically give a really brief overview. Quantum mechanics is our most successful scientific theory. It's a theory about subatomic particles. And we have a very, very successful set of equations that can predict what happens in the world. So data and mathematics fit really nicely together. And so in that sense, quantum mechanics is one of our most successful theories. The problem is philosophers and physicists disagree on what quantum mechanics actually says about the world. So there are various different interpretations of what the mathematics and the data tell us about the world. One of them is the Copenhagen interpretation. That's like textbook quantum mechanics. Another is Bohmian mechanics. And another is the Everett or many worlds interpretation. And basically, the Everett or many worlds interpretation says that every time a quantum event occurs, and there's loads of different things that count as a quantum event, but there's billions of them happening every second. It's every time a quantum object in a superposition becomes entangled with its environment, which happens all the time. But again, that's a bit technical. So just for our present purposes, there's these things called quantum events that are happening all the time. And when a quantum event occurs, so say when you measure the location of an electron, the Copenhagen interpretation, textbook quantum mechanics, says that the equation previously existed in a superposition, so all the possible states it could exist in, until it's measured. And the act of measurement collapses the wave function and forces the electron to choose a particular location. And you can only predict within a probabilistic range which outcome will occur. You don't know for sure what's going to happen, but you can say it's more likely to be here than here, etc. According to the Everett interpretation, it's not just one thing that happens, it's everything. So as soon as a quantum event takes place, all the possible outcomes that could occur do occur. But what happens is they occur in different branches of the universe. So basically, every second, the universe is branching into potentially an infinite number of new branches, each of which contain a copy of the world, but with a different outcome of the event, including the experimental apparatus, the lab that it's happening in, the people in that room, and everything else in the world. So what you're left with is an interpretation of quantum mechanics that says that we're actually living in a multiverse with many, many, many different versions of us whose lives then go off to evolve slightly differently. And I'm interested in what that means for theology and for philosophy.
Sure. So these are obviously topics, areas that are quite odd and counterintuitive. Like how much, I guess you've been looking at these kind of areas roughly for at least a decade or so, these kind of things. Have your views on these topics like kind of radically changed over time? Did things you used to think sounded a lot more absurd now seem a lot more realistic? I'm just intrigued by your journey going into such like an unusual space.
Yeah, so the many worlds interpretation sounded completely wacky, unrealistic to me when I first encountered it, because it is very counterintuitive. It's very weird, it's very science fiction-y, and importantly, we don't experience any of this happening. So I don't feel like I'm branching into millions of copies of me every second. So I thought, surely this can't be, this can't be the way that the world is, right? And I still don't want to endorse the many worlds interpretation. I'm just not sure. I don't think we know enough yet to say which version of quantum mechanics is right. But there are some real benefits to going with this interpretation. And the people more and more people are supporting it all the time. It's becoming a very, very serious contender for the right way to think about quantum mechanics and therefore the right way to think about the world that we live in. And that's because it is just, according to its proponents, quantum mechanics taken seriously and left at that. So other interpretations add collapse mechanisms or different variables, hidden variables, for example. They try and augment the quantum mathematics in various ways to try and give us a single world, unpredictability, whatever it might be that you want with that interpretation. And the many worlds interpretation just says, let's look at what quantum mechanics says. If you don't add any additional variables, if you don't change the mathematics at all, what does it tell us? And it seems to imply that the universe is branching all the time. And so wacky though it might be, it's being more and more taken seriously in this by scientists. And therefore, I think philosophers and theologians have a duty to take it seriously as well, even if it turns out that if it ends up that it's not the correct way to view things. I think science and religion, the field that I work in, is always stronger and more interesting, more creative when it's engaging with these cutting edge ideas, even if there's some possibility that they're going to turn out to be wrong. Because the alternative is that we're just always on the back foot. We're waiting for scientists to confirm whether a theory is right. And we might be 50, 60, 100 years behind where the science is. And that's not acceptable to me. So I'd rather take the risk and engage with something a bit more wacky in the hopes that it turns out to be right, rather than the alternative, which is like allowing philosophy and theology to become stagnant and fall behind the science.
Interesting. Okay. What are you doing to that topic or on that topic or writing about related to it?
Yeah, so I'm not trying to do anything with the many worlds interpretation that changes the interpretation. That's not my role. That's really the role of the physicist or the person working in quantum foundations, so the kind of borderline between physics and philosophy. What I want to do is take the many worlds interpretation at face value and say, okay, let's imagine that this is how the world is. It's a kind of if X, then Y approach. So if this is how the world is, then what follows? What does that mean for personal identity? Can we survive branching? Can we continue to exist from one moment to the next if I feel like I'm one person, but actually I'm branching into millions of other people all the time? And is this the kind of world that a loving God would want to create? So it's the philosophical and theological questions that follow that I'm really interested in asking.
Okay. And I think it's becoming clear in chatting to you that to divide up necessarily into philosophy and science isn't always clear cut and easy. But
yeah,
whilst doing your work, if you are to kind of roughly divide things, something that is possible to some extent, like how much do you find yourself going for, scientific papers and reading those, and then philosophical papers, like the kind of split between those, if that's again appropriate to talk about that split at all?
Yeah, so it really depends on the kind of thing that I'm doing. So if I'm writing a book mainly engaging with theological questions, philosophical questions, I'll look mainly to philosophy and theology literature. If there's science involved, I will, of course, go to the scientific papers as well. So the book that came out last year, the end of last year, was my PhD thesis, and then it became a book. And it was on the philosophy and physics of time and what that means for theology. And in that, I had to read a lot of scientific papers, really try and get my head around relativity, understand what Einstein was saying and how the experiments since have verified his work. And then there's some philosophy, of course, like thinking about what all that means, and then theology. So really, you have to engage with all of them. And that is a challenge because we're trained as academics generally in one area. So I was trained in philosophy and theology. I wasn't trained in science. So you have to teach yourself how to read scientific papers, and that is a challenge.
Okay, interesting. Okay, speaking of time, let's go back in time and ask you a little bit about your kind of journey to where you are now. So what was the youngest age you remember being intrigued by kind of philosophical questions, or even if you weren't aware they were philosophical questions at the time?
I think if you asked my parents, they would say it was as soon as I could talk. I think I was a very annoying child, always asking questions about why. Weirdly, apparently, the two things that I was really fascinated by when I was a very small child was the moon and the tops of churches. I used to love pointing out the steeples of churches in cities. And that's basically physics and theology. I mean, whether I had any choice to end up in this field, maybe not. It seems like it was something that was in different ways, obviously fascinating to me from a very early age.
Sure. Okay. When did you kind of, I guess, more formally understand it as being philosophy, and maybe perhaps decide that you think philosophy and theology are the kind of things you want to do at university?
Yeah, so I did, at GCSE, there was this option, I think it was to do a half GCSE in philosophical and religious stuff. I think maybe it was called ethics, but it was philosophy and religion. And I did this half GCSE and absolutely loved it. And so I decided to do A-level philosophy, and it was mainly the philosophy of religion. And so I was just hooked. I really find questions about who we are, how we should live in the world, really fascinating. And, whether there's a God, what the world is really like, all that stuff. So finding a subject where I could spend all my time thinking about those questions was just fantastic to me. And I've never been particularly good at maths. Like, I was fine at maths, but it's never been my strong suit, which really cuts off being able to have a career in physics because you have to be exceptional at maths. So philosophy and theology allowed me another route to thinking about questions that relate to physics as well. I can think about these ideas, but from a philosophical perspective, rather than having to be mathematical genius, which sadly I'm not.
Sure. Yeah. So you're at Cambridge now, but your undergrad and your master's and your PhD were all at Oxford. Kind of more broadly, how did you find your time at Oxford? What's the university like?
I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect institution, but I love the city. It's vibrant. It's ancient. It's very, very multicultural. So I love living in the city. It's where I still live now. And I really liked the university. So I went to a state school. Basically, no one in my year went to Oxbridge. It was just me and one other girl went to Cambridge. It was not expected that people from my educational background would go to Oxford. And so when I got there, it was just like, it was incredible to be around so many people who were also interested in the stuff that I was interested in. I'm still very, very close with my friends from school and I love them so much, but they're not interested in philosophy and theology in the way that I am, which is fine. So going to uni and finding other people who were was brilliant. But it was also challenging to come from a normal background and suddenly be in an environment where you're having formal dinners in gowns and people are speaking, like doing grace in Latin. And it's very alienating to not be part of that world and then suddenly be thrown into it. Whereas a lot of the people who I went to uni with were privately educated and it was less of a culture shock for them. So yeah, in most ways, I really loved Oxford, but there were parts of the institution that were kind of took me off guard as somebody from like an ordinary state school background.
So when you were doing your bachelor's, do you think you knew at that point you were going to continue to go do a master's or PhD? Were you super into it then, or has this all just kind of unfolded?
Yeah, I don't think so. Maybe in my first term, I think everybody does. They're like, oh, I love it. I'm going to do a master's. But then that sort of fell off the radar. I had a great time in Oxford and I worked very hard, but I also didn't work as hard as some people would throughout the whole degree. I went out a lot and did a lot of social stuff. And so I didn't do particularly well in all of the like practice exams leading up to finals. So Oxford's kind of unusual in that your entire degree is based on 8 exams you take at the end of the degree in the last 3 weeks. So you can take it very, very seriously at the end and less so throughout the rest of it and do well. So I wasn't expecting to do particularly well, but I really, really worked hard for finals and I came top of my year. And then I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is something that I can pursue further. But you have to plan that quite far in advance. So I took a year out. I had a job in recruitment. I hated it. I got fired. I went traveling for like 6 months. And then I decided I was going to come back and do a master's. And from there, I really decided like, this is what I want to do. And I'm going to see how far I can take it.
Fantastic. Do you remember what your master's dissertation was on and your PhD thesis? What were both these big essays on?
So they were both on the same thing and they were on the topic that's become my first 2 books. So it was on the philosophy and physics of time stuff. So I really started doing that in my master's. And I've published 2 books on that topic. So one of them is the one I was talking about earlier, which is Salvation in the Block Universe. It's an academic monograph. It's very expensive. I know I should be promoting it, but like for most people, it's not. It's like £85. It's just not affordable. But I did write my first book, which is called Gods and Salvation and the Problem of Space-Time, where I look at time in philosophy and in physics, and then implications for theology. And that's much shorter. It's for a general audience and it's more digestible. So if people are interested in reading a bit more about it, that book is somewhere that I would point them to.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your books, because I know you've written 3 and you've, I think, got one about to come out in a couple of years. Or
So I've written 3, but one of them is coming out next year. And I've got a 4th one that is being written at the moment. Yeah, but that'll be a while.
Sure, yeah. And I've had a few philosophers on this podcast, so I've kind of seen, the output that philosophers, like, at least some philosophers do throughout their career. I think it's just very impressive. Someone of your age, you've got, well, nearly-ish 4 books out. Why do you think you've been able to get so many books out already? It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I don't know. I love writing, so that's a big part of it for me. Is that writing is just something I've always loved. So from a very early age, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I thought maybe I'd write fiction or poetry or whatever, I didn't know, but it's always been writing for me. So I enjoy that. Another like slightly more profane and boring answer is that I was doing my PhD during the pandemic. And so there was literally nothing else to do other than do a lot of writing. And also I was very lucky to get a research job out of my PhD where I spent 3 years being able to mainly do writing. I did have my philosophy lectureship on top of that, but it wasn't too demanding a teaching load. So I could spend a lot of time writing. Not a lot of early career academics get that opportunity. So I was really, really lucky to be able to have a PhD in the pandemic where I could get a lot done. And then this 3-year research fellowship at Oxford, where I wrote my first 2 books, and actually most of the third one as well. I finished the third one during my time at Cambridge, and that's coming out in March next year.
Yeah, so onto your 4th book. Are you finding that much easier to write than your first book? Have you learned a lot about how to write books?
Yeah. It gets easier every time. So the 4th book is about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, as we've been talking about. And it's going to be for a general audience. It's not going to be a dense academic monograph like my PhD thesis book. There's a place for both kinds of book, but I think I prefer writing for a more general audience than just a few philosophers. So yeah, it's going to be exploring the many worlds interpretation. What does it mean for human beings? What does it mean for our place in the world? And are there any implications for God? And yeah, it's definitely easier the 4th time around. You know how to plan it and how to go about writing it and a realistic time frame for getting it done, all that stuff that you're learning as you write the first one.
Sure. And you've done quite a lot of, podcast interviews, things on YouTube and so on. Is that something you're particularly you want to do throughout your career, go to a wider audience as opposed to just writing for the academics?
Yeah, it's important to me. It's important to me for a few reasons. One, I think it's hard for people to get access to these elite institutions. And so, but lots of people are fascinated by these ideas. And so I think we do have a responsibility as academics at places like Oxford and Cambridge to share these ideas with wider audiences rather than kind of gatekeeping them in a way. And also, like, it's important to me as a young woman to be visible in this space. Philosophy and theology are dominated by men, often older men. And as a young female student, I mean, in my time in Oxford, I was taught by more men named Andrew than I was women. So that tells you a lot about how many women there are in this field. And I think it's important to have my voice, my face out there so that young female students see that if you want a career in this, you can have one. It's not going to be as easy, but it is possible. And so I think representation really, really matters. And that's another reason why I like doing this. I also, I like meeting new people and speaking to them, and people, find it interesting. So there's lots of different reasons that I like doing interviews.
Sure. For all of the interesting questions you look at each day and have learned, has this had much impact on you personally in your personal life, or is this just an isolated and fascinating thing to get up to at work? How does this impact you outside of work?
Some days not at all, and some days it does a lot. I think it's definitely made me, in some senses, it's made me a lot more understanding and appreciative of religion, much more respectful of religion. It's also made me deeply, deeply angry at religious fundamentalists, people who use religion to be hateful, homophobic, transphobic, all of because I've studied theology and I know that you don't have to interpret religious scripture that way. So in a way, it's made me more tolerant of religion as a whole, and it's also made me much more intolerant of misapplications of religion, using religion for nefarious gain, for political power, for the oppression of minorities and stuff. And also just like studying the philosophy of time messes with your head sometimes. So sometimes you do really have to compartmentalize it and say, like, that's what I do at work and at home. I'm not going to think about the fact that all the different versions of me exist somewhere out there in the block universe, and does time really pass, and all that stuff. So yeah, try and keep some things as something that I just do at work.
I'm not sure if you were kind of half joking when you said it messes with your head. Is it something that can actually stress you out, or are you just saying it's
Yeah, it kind of can. It can weird you out sometimes. You just have moments of being like, oh, is time real? Just be like, no, don't think about that too much. Yeah.
Are you someone who's thought much about this? I guess this the simulation hypothesis or argument, the idea that whether or not we maybe live in a simulation. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a bit. And that's something that I think actually doesn't really matter, to me at least. I think, well, my experience is my experience. Whether I'm a simulation, so whether I'm made out of like some computer stuff or whether I'm made out of like weird like atoms and energy, both of those things, when you think about them too deeply, are kind of strange. And so, I don't know, what matters most to me is my experience, my first person encounter with the world and the people that I live in the world with. And if it's not, I don't worry too much about like how real all of that is.
Sure. Yeah. So on to the final question, Emily. I always ask the same question at the end of the show to guests. So final question is, what do you think it means to live a good life?
Yeah, probably the most important question that there is, and could be answered in a sentence or a whole book. I'll try not to be too verbose in my answer. I mean, I think what it means to live a good life is to live a life that's fundamentally about connection and compassion. So living a life where you have deep, meaningful relationships, where you move through the world in a way that doesn't harm other people. Very, very crucially for me is also living a life that doesn't harm animals, doesn't involve exploiting them, consuming them. So not limiting our empathy to other humans, but extending it to all creatures that can suffer and feel pain. So it's about compassion and connection, really, for me.
Great. Well, Emily, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to speak. Yeah, truly fascinating. Usual great work for opportunities. So best of luck in the future with everything. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me.